Here's a long video on climate change and the work of the Federal Emergency Act following destructive weather. Carbon dioxide, climate change, wildfires, hurricanes, sea surge, and more appear here. Michael Mann, climate scientist, Alexandria Acasio-Cortez, and others discuss some of the related issues. Climate deception repeatedly appears as congressional representative jockey around their various supporters' ideologies. Also, find a link to Ocasio-Cortez in a video concerning the role of Exxon and the fossil fuel industry's part in moral corruption. Note, this is a biased presentation of the C-SPAN video. A link to the original appears below. It's about 50 minutes long in the original version, which shows the deceptive practices at work. If not deceptive practives, these behaviors reflect ignorance.
State municipalities. Thank you very much. Now recognize Dr. Mann for 5 minutes of oral testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Michael Mann. I am Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State University and Director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center, and I do have to say I feel a little bit today like I'm at the center of a curry sandwich. Sorry. The primary focus of my research is understanding Earth's climate system. I'm a fellow of numerous scientific societies. I was awarded the Hans Oeschger Medal of the European Geophysical Union in 2012, the Friend of the Planet Award from the National Center for Science Education in 2014, Stephen Schneider Award for Outstanding Climate Science Communication in 2017, Award for Public Engagement with Science from the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2018, Climate Communication Prize from the American Geophysical Union in 2018, and this year I received the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. I've authored more than 200 publications and 4 books. I am perhaps best known for my paleoclimate research 2 decades ago that produced the iconic, or now iconic, hockey stick curve demonstrating the unprecedented nature of recent warming. My research in recent years, however, has focused on extreme weather events. I would like to talk about the substantial progress that has been made in this area in recent years, and I would also like to emphasize that we're using the term natural disasters, but in many cases there is absolutely nothing natural about the disasters we are talking about. We're not saying they have been caused by climate change, we're saying that climate change has worsened them. That's what the research says. There's an emerging consensus, for example, now that we will see stronger and wetter hurricanes, and we're seeing them already. Hurricanes get their energy from warm ocean waters, and the oceans are warming from the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels. The strongest hurricanes have gotten stronger. Over the past few years, we have witnessed the most intense hurricanes on record for the globe, both hemispheres, the Pacific, and as of summer 2017 with Hurricane Irma, the open Atlantic, with Maria, a similarly strong and devastating storm, coming just weeks later. With a recent post-season upgrade in status, Michael, my namesake, sea level established as the latest storm surge from hurricanes now rides on top of higher seas in U.S. history, having devastated parts of Florida to infiltrate further into our coastal cities. Landfall last October has shown, for example, that the combined effect of global sea level rise and intensifying due to human-induced warming has taken extra moisture leads to heavier rainfall. Superstorm rainfall rates in hurricanes are expected to increase in a warmer world, and we're living that reality. From what would have been a 500-year event before we caused warming of the planet to a 25-year event, and if we continue with business as usual burning of fossil fuels, by the middle of this century it will become a 5-year event. That means a Sandy-like storm surge on average once every 5 years. Heavier rain and higher sea levels combine to cause compound flooding and major hurricanes. We saw this effect in play in the catastrophic flooding in 2017 with Harvey and in 2018 with Florence. Summer 2018 saw an unprecedented spate of extreme floods, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires break out across North America, Europe, and Asia. A warmer ocean evaporates more moisture into the atmosphere, so you get worse flooding from coastal storms. Think again, Hurricanes Harvey and Florence. Warmer soils evaporate more moisture into the atmosphere, so you get worse droughts. Global warming shifts the extreme tail of the bell curve, so you get more temperature extremes, more frequent and intense heat waves. Think summer 2018 all around the northern hemisphere. You combine heat and drought, it's not rocket science, you get worse wildfires. And think about what we're seeing in the western U.S. Running climate models both with and without human impacts, we can investigate whether a particular event was likely to have been made more common, more frequent because of human-caused warming. And in that sense, we're able to attribute certain events to the extreme nature of these events to climate change. The scorching European heat wave last summer, according to one such attribution study, was made more than twice as likely because of human-caused warming. The record rainfall in North Carolina with Florence, according to another study, it was increased by as much as 50% by human-caused warming. Some of the impacts of climate change on extreme weather events, on the other hand, are too subtle to be captured by current generation climate models. In a study my co-authors and I published in the journal Science Advances recently, we identified a key factor behind the rise in extreme summer weather events like the ones that played out in summer 2018. And it's not captured by current generation climate models. We showed that climate change is causing the meanders in the summer jet stream to become more pronounced, and they are tending to remain locked in place for longer stretches of time. Under these circumstances, when, for example, a deep high-pressure ridge, as we call it, is stuck in the western U.S., you get that extreme heat and drought and wildfires, while downstream, you get a trough, what we call a trough, a low-pressure center associated with the unprecedented rainfall that we saw over large parts of the eastern U.S. Last year. We are seeing something very similar now happening right now this summer. Well, climate change contrarians love to point to scientific uncertainty for justification for inaction on climate, but uncertainty is a reason for even more concerted action. We already know that the projections have historically underestimated the rate of ice sheet melting and the rate of sea level rise, and now it appears they're underestimating the increases in extreme weather associated with climate change because of processes that aren't well captured in the climate models. Uncertainty is not our friend here. Consequences of doing nothing grow by the day. The time to act is now. Climate change is pain. And anyone who tells you differently is selling something, most likely fossil fuels.
Dr. Mann, I need you to conclude your comments.
Absolutely. There we are.
Excellent timing. And good luck with your...
Administrator Long, FEMA eliminated all references to climate change from its 4-year strategic plan. Back in Michigan's 13th congressional district that I proudly represent, we know climate change is happening. We see it all the time. We have had one of the wettest years on record with widespread flooding across my district, which has recently this year forced the governor to declare a state of emergency. So just to make sure, and this is a question for all of you all on the panel, is there anyone on this panel who believes climate change is not currently happening? Okay, that's wonderful. Everyone on this panel believes climate change is occurring, and yet FEMA removed all references to it in its plan for the next 4 years. The decision concerns me greatly. An agency tasked with responding to natural, weather-related disasters cannot remove all references to changes in climate and expect for you all to do your job or for the department to do their job. FEMA pretending climate change doesn't exist is not an action plan. So Mr. Witt, as a former director of FEMA and Dr. Mann as a climate scientist, does it concern you that FEMA removed climate change from its strategic plan? And is it important for FEMA to commit to incorporating climate change in their long-term planning?
I think climate change is a big part of what we're seeing today. Last month, the month of May, we had 500 tornadoes. A year ago, May, it was 240. We just had a historic river flood on the Arkansas River. It was the biggest flood since 1945, 16 to 18 feet higher than it crested in 1945. We see at my farm, we got 6 inches of rain in 2 hours, which has never happened. We have seen 10 to 20 inches of rain in Iowa and Oklahoma and in the Midwest, and it's causing an extreme amount of flooding. So we're facing sea level rising, everything from California to the East Coast. That is part of climate change. Our ocean is warming. We're having more hurricanes because the ocean is warming, and they're much stronger and much more devastating. So yes, I believe it's happening.
And former Witt, and before I go to, do you think this affected FEMA's effectiveness in responding to natural disasters when they chose not to consider climate change when developing a strategic plan?
I don't think it affected their response to disasters. I think it affects them in the way of the long-term planning and how to mitigate it for the future. So that has to be a qualifier.
Yeah, and Dr. Mann?
Yeah, I I wanted to correct a number of fallacies that we've heard here today when it comes to the connection between climate change and extreme weather events. First of all, you sometimes hear this myth about there having been a supposed hurricane drought. And there's some sleight of hand going on there, because what's going on, Superstorm Sandy was a strong Category 3 and then weakened to a Category 2 hurricane off the coast of the U.S. East Coast. Now, it did go, as they say, extratropical. It technically was no longer a hurricane when it made landfall, but it was spinning off the East Coast for several days as a strong hurricane, building up a very large storm surge. And as we know, it was the storm surge that was so devastating to the Jersey coast and to New York City. So it's extremely misleading when you hear statements like that. And of course, Michael, my namesake, is one of a very small number of landfalling Category 5 hurricanes. It's the latest in the season we've ever seen that. So there's a clear climate change.
Absolutely, and thank you, Mr. Mann. And I'll tell you, misleading comments seems to be a norm here, and I'm making sure that I don't allow anybody to think it's normal to mislead. It's the same thing as lying. On June 14th, 2019, emails obtained by Environmental Defense Fund clearly show the culture of climate denial in the Trump White House. William Haper, a member of the President's National Security Council and the chair of the reported White House panel, convened solely to question the scientific evidence on climate change, said in emails to the Heartland Institute, a climate change denying interest group, that he wanted to figure out a way to make his ideas, quote, more useful to a wider readership. Mr. Hepper also emailed NASA Administrator Jim Brinston to say that NASA should, quote, systematically sidestep the science on global warming. So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would like to enter these emails into record. I wish this wasn't shocking, but unfortunately this is part of the...
It's my time, thank you. I reclaim my time.
I asked the gentlelady
Dr.
to
Mann.
The chair recognizes Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you,
Please.
and Mr. Chair, I would like to...
Dr. Curry should be allowed to respond.
The chair recognizes Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. This
Thank
is
you
her
so
time, and her time will be restored due to the interruption.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it despite the attempts to take my time away where there is no statute in the rules where that is appropriate or acceptable. I will move on. So the Puerto Rican island of Vieques is located nearly 8 miles from mainland Puerto Rico. In the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, my grandfather died. And the island of Vieques is where 9,000 American citizens live. These Americans are still suffering today, almost 2 years after Hurricane Maria devastated the island. On November 29, 2017, more than 2 months after Hurricane Maria, an individual whose name has been redacted emailed Michael Byrne, FEMA's lead official in Puerto Rico. This person wrote, and I quote, "We have limited to no communications. Without the grid, no cell tower or landline is available. Internet service needs power, and like it or not, this is the means of global communication. Our water system is currently run on emergency generators. The key word here is emergency. They need regular power. Without potable water and proper sewage treatment, we will get sick." This email was then forwarded from what appears to be a different individual's email address, and the FEMA administrator at the time, Brock Long, was copied on this email. The second individual writes, "I know you have had a rough time in Houston, but at least you had competent people in charge of the response. We have incompetent people in charge here, and are getting no response to our urgent needs. First of all, restoration of power." Mr. Witt, if you were leading FEMA's recovery to Hurricane Maria, what would have been your plan for addressing electrical outages on the island of Vieques?
Well, I wasn't in place at the time that happened. Mm-hmm. And wasn't coordinating in the response, but let me just share this with you. Hurricane Marilyn that hit the Virgin Islands. I flew down there, and it destroyed power, water, infrastructure, airport, and we were able to get things up and running extremely fast.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I also want to ask you about the island of Vieques' only hospital, which was destroyed during the storm and to this day has not yet been rebuilt. The New York Times published a story in April of this year that reported that pregnant women in Vieques were forced to travel by boat or plane to the, quote, Big Island, 8 miles away to give birth, while dialysis patients had to travel 3 times weekly by boat or plane for more than a year after Maria hit. According to that same New York Times report, the hospital remains to this day, quote, a shuttered wreck of rust and mold. Mr. Witt, when you were the leader of FEMA, was it a priority for you to rebuild hospitals destroyed by hurricanes?
Yes, it was. Earthquakes as well. There's a company that we work with actually looking at Mozambique right now that can fly in a hospital that they set up. It's a 500-bed hospital as well as mobile clinics.
Thank you. And is there anything FEMA could be doing now that it is not currently doing to help rebuild critical infrastructures like hospitals in Puerto Rico?
You know, I've been to Puerto Rico several times since the hurricane and doing some work down there, particularly in the housing as well as the energy side. You know, it's hard for me to answer that question by not being there in the middle of it. Would I have done it different? I don't know. I can't tell you because I haven't really looked at the problems or what happened there.
I understand. Thank you very much. I yield the rest of my time to the chair.
I'm sorry, did you yield back? And Chair grants you an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. Mr. Witt, or rather, Dr. Mann, as climate change worsens, we know through scientific consensus and modeling that more environmental disasters are to come, correct?
Absolutely.
Now, and Mr. Witt, FEMA is, you know, as its name implies, it's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Its primary responsibility is in the short-term and emergency management of natural disasters, correct?
It's short-term, long-term.
Short-term and long-term. Do you believe that the agency is fully resourced and is actively planning for the full-term transition of the United States infrastructure to accommodate for sea level rises and other changes brought by natural disasters and climate change?
Time has expired, but you can answer the question.
I think that there's a lot that needs to be done, as Mr. Curry had said earlier, particularly in the training side of employees and new employees that's come on board. We had a very, very important training program when I reestablished FEMA and rebuilt it. And I think also that with the amount of people that they have on board now, which I had 2,600 employees, full-time employees, and I think they've got almost 9,000 now. But you know, they've had 220 federal disasters in 2 years. I had 340 in 8 years. So you can tell that it's changing very quickly, and climate change is a big part of it.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes of questioning, and I'd like to start with just making sure we level set here. And there's been some discussion, as the ranking member suggested, that after a natural disaster or a significant storm that there's media that says it occurred because of climate change. And hopefully that's not happening, and I've not seen anybody actually say that, so I would agree with them if it is being said that's incorrect. But what is correct is that climate change is causing storms and weather events to be bigger, better, meaner, and more often. And is there anybody on the panel that disagrees with that comment? Dr. Curry does not agree with that comment. So Dr. Curry, if I understand your testimony correctly, you are suggesting that there is either no evidence of human-caused climate change or insufficient evidence of human-caused climate change. Is that correct?
No, I thought your question was specifically with regards to natural disasters and extreme weather events.
Well, let me ask you, do you believe that humankind is causing climate change?
As a scientist, believe is not in my vocabulary.
Do you have scientific data that supports the belief?
No,
The outcome, the evidence?
No, I provide assessments
Okay.
of
Would you agree
evidence
that if we
for-
doubled the burning of fossil fuels, that would arguably increase temperatures faster in our atmosphere?
Sure, the question is how much relative to natural variability. That is the big question.
Agreed, there is natural variability, but Dr. Mann, what would your take be on that? Is there a point where we can agree that burning of fossil fuels impacts climate change and global warming.
And despite what Dr. Curry has said, there is in fact a robust consensus, and the various assessment reports she referred to actually demonstrate that there is a detectable human impact on these natural disasters, on hurricanes, on wildfires, et cetera. Now, when she talks about these natural cycles, and she referred to the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, well, I coined that term. More than a decade and a half ago, and it is based on research that I published at the time. More recent research by my group and myself has shown that what many of these scientists are attributing to a natural cycle is in fact just the impact of humans on the climate, but the irregularity. Because we had an increase in blocking of sunlight from pollutants in the 1950s through the 1970s, so there was sort of a plateau in warming, and then it accelerated when we passed the Clean Air Acts. So if you subtract off a line, you get what looks like an oscillation left over, but it's not a real oscillation. It's just the irregularity of our impact.
Well, and you mentioned the Clean Air Act. I'm just curious because I want to have the testimony here. Climate change, global warming aside, is there anybody here that doesn't think that renewables over fossil fuels would improve the air and the health of Americans? Well, that's good to see.
There was this claim made that most of the increase in wildfires, in fact, I believe it was our president who claimed that it was just a matter of needing more rakes at some point. And we heard sort of a semblance of that claim earlier here in this room today. There are scientists who have very carefully looked at the impact of changing land use patterns, changing fire suppression practices, and the impact that both those factors and the human-caused factor of climate change has played. And what they conclude, if you look at the tripling, and yes, there's been a tripling in the extent of wildfire in the western U.S. over the past few decades. No more than half of that can be explained by any of these other factors. At least half of it is due to the warming and the drying and the perfect storm that creates for these massive, very fast-spreading wildfires.
And prior to the invention of rakes, what did humankind do with these forests?
Slash and burn.
Thank you. That concludes my questions. I'd like to thank the first panel for their testimony, and you are free to go.
Thank you.
As the witnesses are switching out, please be aware that you may receive additional written questions for the hearing record, and we would appreciate your prompt and thorough response. We are going to take a short break, and then we'll welcome our final witnesses and get started again.